Thank you for joining us online at Crossroads Community Church. We hope you enjoy this sermon from our most recent service, but we'd love for you to join us in person at Crossroads. We invite you to attend one of our services next weekend. We meet on Saturday nights at 6:30 p.m. and Sunday mornings at 9:30 and 11 a.m. If you would like to join our mission to connect people with God, visit us at www.crossroads.cc, where you can make a one-time donation or set up a recurring donation to support what God is doing at Crossroads. Enjoy the service.
Well, we're in the middle of a series called Celebrate, and we've been celebrating our 25th anniversary as a church, and man, we partied last night. Did you guys enjoy that? We partied last night. Incredible night, and I've been asking the question, do you want to be a part of something greater? Do you want to be a part of something greater? John 14:12 says, Jesus says that those who believe in me will do the things that I've done, and they'll be able to do even greater things than these. That's the challenge. Do we want to do greater things? Do we want to be a part of something greater? Do we want to just settle for being a good church, or do we want to be a great church? We've been talking about greater perspective and urgency and all of those kinds of greater things. Today I want to talk to you about greater faith. Greater faith. If the question I asked you today was, how do you make your biceps bigger? All of us would say, go to the gym, do some curls. If the question was, how do you make your pecs bigger? You would say, do some push-ups, do some bench presses, some flies, yeah. If the question was, how do I increase my savings account? Well, then we just have Chris Waske come up and tell us how to do that. We'd all say, hey, make a budget and intentionally put money in savings. If the question was, how do I lose weight? We'd say, exercise. What did you say? Quit eating, yeah. Well, let's not quit eating. Let's do portion control and exercise, right? If the question was, how do I become a better singer? Then talk to one of the people that were just on the worship stage and ask them to give you voice lessons. If the question is, how do I do better on an upcoming test? Then what would we say? Study, study, study. But if the question is, how do I get stronger in my faith? How can I see a greater faith in me? The answers don't come quite as easily. You may say something like, I should go to church more. And I'd say, yeah, you should. Every week, no matter the weather, you should be here. Some of you are thinking, well, maybe I should pray more. Absolutely. That's the lifeblood. Some of you are thinking, I should read my Bible more. And I'm a huge advocate of that, and I challenge you on that all the time. Take your Bible out and read it. If you got 10, 15 minutes a day, and set aside that time and read it and let God speak to you through it, because it is alive and He will speak to you through His Word. And all of those are good answers, and they'll all add muscle to your faith. But if that's all that was necessary, then how come people that we would consider have great faith struggle so often, right? You with me? You struggle. You have spiritual fatigue. Any of you ever have spiritual fatigue before? Weakness in your faith. But I want to have a greater faith. You want to have a greater faith? I want to talk to you today about having a greater faith. It reminds me of a man named Joe who was in dire need. His business had busted, and he was in huge financial trouble. So he begins to pray to God, God, I've lost my business, and I need some money. I'm going to lose my house. Can you just help me win the lottery? And so lottery night comes, and somebody else wins, and so Joe again begins to pray again, God, please, God, I've lost my house, my business, and now soon to be my car. You've got to step in here, God. I pray, help me win the lottery. Well, lottery night comes again, and he doesn't win. So once again he prays, God, why have you forsaken me? I've lost my business and my house and my car, and my children and my wife are hungry. Please let me win the lottery so I can get things back together again. And suddenly there's a flash of light and a thundering voice from heaven with these words, Joe, meet me halfway on this. Buy a ticket. Faith, right? Greater faith. Greater faith. Any of you adventurous type people? Any of you like to have your adrenaline pumping? A couple of years ago, we were on the men's retreat, which, by the way, is 3 weeks away or something like that? 3 weeks away. We were on a men's retreat. There was a high ropes course that was there. You guys might remember that were there. And I mean, it was the real deal. It was way up high, and just a huge chunk of the guys got there and were like, yeah, let's do it, and they run out there. I had already made up my mind walking up this little hill, over to where it was, that I wasn't going to do it. I was just going to watch. It's not that I'm afraid of heights, I just don't really care for them. You know what I mean? And so I'm like, I'm just going to go over there and watch a few of these guys climb around on this ropes course. And man, when I got there, it was confirmed. I'm just going to watch what these guys are doing. Well, it didn't take long before my ego was threatened on the ground. My manhood was challenged. It's like, you got to get up on this thing. Come on, Pastor Aaron, you big chicken, and all that kind of stuff. So I went up on the course. Now, there's on the edge of the course, the only way down, which, by the way, it was I don't know how high it was, but it was really, really high. And the whole time, like, my heart is pounding 100 miles an hour, and I'm holding on. You got one rope on your feet and one in your hand. You're like, I'm doing that the whole time, and I'm about to pass out. But I get to the end, and a lot of the guys stayed up there for a really long time. You remember that, Shane? I mean, forever and ever. And I just went and went right to the end. I'm like, okay, I'm done now. One cut, then I'm over there. Well, the only way down from this thing was this pendulum swing. You guys remember the pendulum swing? So it's it's just a straight drop down, and then you'd swing out and back, and until you got stopped, and then they'd set up an A-frame ladder and help you down off this thing. And so I went through it and got on the edge where I'm getting ready to go down this pendulum swing, and they strap you to it, and I remember the feeling of it was pulling you out, like, off to the edge of this thing. I'm like, oh my gosh, And so they're like, are you ready? And I'm like, I don't know. Give me 1 second. Give me a second. So I prayed and asked Jesus to come into my heart again just to make sure. And then it was like 1, 2, 3, go. And we just swung off this thing. And oh man, the only thing holding me from dying was this rope. I don't know if you've ever felt that way before. Christian life can be a lot like that, can it? We make a decision to follow Christ, and many of you have, and some of you haven't, but you follow Christ. But then there's this point in your life where you get to a place where it's like it needs legs. It needs strong legs, because you're going to face challenges and obstacles and difficulties and overwhelming situations and things that seem impossible, and it's going to require this 5-letter word out of you: faith. Faith, something that's completely misunderstood in our world today. For example, Richard Dawkins, a famous evolutionist, says faith is the big cop-out. It's the big cop-out. It's the reason people believe when there's no reason to believe, which is false. Some people believe that faith is like a genie lamp. You rub God's belly, and then he comes out and he gives you whatever you want. You'll name it, claim it, stab it, take it, that's it, right? You have that kind of faith. Well, it's not quite that way either. Faith is really a deep-seated confidence in God that regardless of what happens, He's enough. You want to know what faith is? It's pretty simple. 2 words: only God. Only God. If that's all I got, that's all that matters to me. Faith is holding on to God in the face of whatever is going on in your life. So I want to talk to you about that in Hebrews chapter 11. I've shared some of these verses before, and then one of my all-time favorites in Daniel chapter 3. We're going to start in Hebrews chapter 11, and I'm going to give you 3 truths about faith as we go along. You notice in your bulletin that there's a lot of scripture. It was quite challenging to get it all in the bulletin. I appreciate Sue squeezing it in and putting it at a font that you can't even see it or read it, but it's there. Okay, it'll be on the screen as well. The writer of Hebrews, more than likely Luke, is talking about Old Testament heroes of faith, men and women of extraordinary faith. It starts in verse 32. It says, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell." Again, he's talking about these heroes of faith, about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through, what's the word there? Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned into strength, and who became powerful in battle, and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Here are these heroes, man. Aren't these some incredible heroes of the faith? Just incredible heroes. This, by the way, is the first group of people that are listed here by Luke in the book of Hebrews that have extraordinary faith. Pretty impressive list. And then he stops right in the middle of all this and begins to talk about another whole group. But let's talk about the first group first. Samson, he says, facing 1,000 against him, alone with just the jawbone of a donkey, and defeats them. Daniel sitting in the lion's den, facing a lion that would kill him. Women, it says, receive back their dead who, their dead, their friends and family came back to life. Each of these listed, as just having this huge obstacle in front of them. And they pray to God, and God shows himself to be bigger than the obstacle that's in front of them. Samson stands before those 1,000 men and has a jawbone of a donkey and prays, and God delivers and is bigger than that whole situation. Daniel, who's in the lion's den with a hungry lion, and prays, and God delivers, right? Extraordinary faith. That's group one. Now look at group two. Right in midstream, as the author is walking through all these people with great faith, and he's saying these people have extraordinary faith, and they do, is what an example. And right in the middle of that, midstream, he changes the whole course or direction of these verses. He says, there were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. Some pretty tough days there. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. This, Crossroads, is group number 2. Now, I know what you're probably thinking right now. How do I get into group number 1? All right, are you with me? Like, how do I get into group number 1? Group number 1, where they face this huge obstacle. They pray, God proves himself bigger than the situation they're in, the obstacle that they're in front of. And then there's group 2 that served the same God, had seen what God had done for people like Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego and Gideon and Barak, and sees what God does in all those situations and cries out and pleads with the same God, and God didn't respond in the same way, you see? You probably wonder, where's God? Where's God? But the writer includes them in the same verses with people who were delivered because of their faith. They experienced a God that was bigger than their obstacle. And then there were those that their obstacle actually killed them. They experienced not that God was bigger than their obstacle, he was, but that God was better than the outcome of what happened. You see the difference there? Some experienced that God was bigger, that he was able. Some experienced that God was better than whatever the outcome was. Even if the outcome wasn't the outcome that they wanted, it was okay because they had a God that was better than the outcome that was laid out in front of them. Now, let me take you to one of the examples of this in Daniel chapter 3, where we see one of these that were listed here with extraordinary faith. Daniel chapter 3, it's an interesting book. Somebody's really upset back there in the nursery. Daniel chapter 3, interesting book. Don't know if you've spent a lot of time reading Daniel chapter 3, but we find ourselves at a place where King Nebuchadnezzar, what mom thought of that name, I'd really like to know. Nebuchadnezzar. That's fun to say. Say it. Nebuchadnezzar. It's a lot of fun. This is a king who has a horrible name and a huge ego, okay? Huge ego. So huge that he had actually built a 90-foot statue, probably of himself, and put it in plain view so that everyone could see this statue. And then when the music would play throughout the day, several times a day, the people's their response to that music should be that they actually bow down to the statue. But there were 3 Hebrew teenagers that were not willing to bow. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you've watched the Veggie Tales, it's Arak, Shaq, and Benny. You guys watch the? I was one of the coolest children's ministry workers that I ever knew. He was sharing the story with the kids, and he said Shadrach, Meshach, and a burger to go. I thought that was pretty cool. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Middle Easterners, and when Middle Easterners would bow down, picture this, they would bow down by placing their face in the dirt. Maybe you've been to a Middle Eastern country. They put their face in the dirt and their butt in the air. Face in the dirt, butt in the air. Now think of it. Maybe 1 million butts in the air, faces in the dirt. Music plays, everyone drops, face in the dirt, butts in the air, except about halfway back are these 3 teenage boys who are standing there like this. Not going to do that. Not going to bow down. Not going to bow down to this idol. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar gets pretty ticked off in verse 13. It says he's furious with rage, and he summons for them, okay? So he's pretty ticked off because, again, it's all about ego. He wants everyone to bow down to the statue that he built of himself, and so he sends for them, and he says to them, you're going to worship me, and they basically send a message back to him that says, shove it, we're not going to do it. We're not going to bow down. Now, again, this is about ego, a lot about ego, but I think there's a second type of issue that's going on here. In the chapter before chapter 3, which would be chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar actually acknowledges that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is the real God, a true God, and that and even worshipped, actually, this God. But now it comes to a place where I don't think he's as ticked off about the fact that they won't, that they're saying or won't worship the God. I think they're more ticked off with the fact that they won't worship the same God that he's worshiping. He's like, hey, I worshiped your God. Now you need to worship my God. Welcome to 21st century America in the Old Testament. Nobody has an issue with the fact that I would say that I serve God, that I'm a pastor in a church. No, people don't have issues with that. When I begin to say things like Jesus is the only way, that's when it gets controversial in a sense. Because it's like this idea of fair treatment. I'll worship your God and you worship my God. The idea here is tolerance. And don't tell me that Jesus is the only way or the only true God, because that's an absolute statement that you're saying, that he's the only way. And there are no absolute statements. You guys have heard some of these things, right? Which is so interesting to me that somebody would say there are no absolute statements, which is actually an absolute statement. This is 21st century America. This is where we live, but it's actually in the Old Testament now. I love the world that we live in. It's quite challenging, but you know what it does? It provides opportunities for God to show that he is bigger and better, to demonstrate his power and to show that he is the one true God. Let me show you how this happens. It says here, let me give you one of these points for you to write down. In verse 14 and 15, we learn that God is bigger than any obstacle that you're facing. God is bigger than any obstacle that you're facing. So he's furious with rage. Nebuchadnezzar summons for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are brought before him, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them in verse 14, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe," there's lots of instruments and all kinds of music, "if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I've made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace." And then he poses this question, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" So they're faced with this test. I'm going to play the music, and when you hear the music, you better bow down and worship this statue that I've built. And if you don't, then I'm going to burn you to death. There's going to be a punishment for it. Now, the question is what God will deliver you. Imagine being in this position, right? Put yourself there for a minute. You're standing before a king who says he's going to burn you if you don't bow down to the image that he's created. You know that you don't want to bow down to the image that he's created. What do you do? We live in a pretty cushy world, at least in our aspects. We don't face this kind of persecution, but one day this kind of persecution may be here, where you have to take a stand like this and say, you know what, God is bigger. He's able to rescue me, and if he doesn't, he's better than whatever the obstacle is, because he's really enough for me. And so here they stand with this huge decision to make, saying and knowing that their God is able. Look what it says in these verses in 16 and 17. Did I already read them to you? It says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, then the God we serve is... Circle that word. Circle it, underline it, prick your finger and use the blood of your finger, whatever you need to do. Make sure you note the word able there, because he is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. They're saying he is able. He is able. He's bigger than the obstacle that's in front of us. He's able to deliver us from your hand and from this obstacle. I believe as Christians, we're often put in situations, and I'd say God even works like this sometimes. We're put in situations that are larger than us, bigger than us, so that we'll cry out to the God that's bigger than the situation that we're in, the obstacle that we're in. Would you agree with that? So that when the obstacle is cleared, no credit goes to me. I didn't weasel my way out of this. God did it. I've been praying and saying, God, do something so great in our church that people would know that only you did it. God, you did it. Do you know what followers of God were first called in the Bible? Not Christians, not Jews, not Hebrews, not Jesus freaks, not fully devoted followers of Christ. In Genesis 4:25, they were called people who call on the name of the Lord. Isn't that cool? People who call on the name of the Lord. People who call on God because they know that God can demonstrate his power and show that he is actually the one true God. A God who responds to prayer. A God who that hears our prayers and is able to deliver us from the situation that we're in. You know what the church was actually called? Wasn't called the house of music or the house of preaching. I love all of those things. You know what it was called? Not the house of entertainment. It's called the house of prayer. The house of prayer. When people say we need to get prayer back in schools, I would say we need to get prayer back in our churches. Yeah. We have a God who responds to prayer. God always places people in impossible situations so that they'll call out to God, people who call on the name of the Lord so that he can show his power. He says, I can do this, and I'm bigger. And we can say, God, you can do it. You're bigger, you're able, you're bigger. You can do this thing. Again, I want God to do some things at Crossroads that are so big that nobody would be able to say that we did it in our own strength. We say, God, only you can do it because you are able. And some of you are facing situations today, I know you are, where you need to call upon the name of the Lord because he is bigger than the obstacle that's in front of you. He is. Second thing I want you to know is that God's better than any outcome. God's better than any outcome. Well, Shadrach keeps talking as he answers the question, and he says, who is this God that's going to save you? And look what it says in verse 18. It says, but even if he, hold on a second, even if he, what? Does not. Oh man, you got to underline that too. Even if he does not, okay, God is able. Yes, he's able. You may throw us in the fiery furnace, but the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. Yes, he's able to deliver us from it. But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the images of gold that you have set up. Even if not, O King, we're not going to bow down and serve you or this God. Translation of that. The God we serve is able. He's bigger than what's in front of us. But we know this for sure. He's better than any outcome. Isn't that good news? He's bigger, but he's better than any outcome. You might throw us in the fire. We might die in that fire, and that's okay. We'd rather die in the flames with God than out here with you. You see, our faith is not in God's ability to deliver us from pain. You got to hear this. Our faith is not in God's ability to deliver us from pain. Our faith in God is that no matter what we're going through, He's enough. He's enough. That's the last point here. He's enough. No matter what. No matter what. What would my life look like if I knew whatever I did, whatever decisions I made, no matter the circumstances that I am in, no matter the difficulties of my life, whether I've died in the flames or not died in the flames, it didn't matter to me because Jesus is enough. And that's all I care about. That's where my faith lies. He's enough. And some of you have called out to God and it doesn't seem to be working. And you're thinking, does He even hear me? Have you ever thought that He may be just giving you a chance to say to Him, you're enough. You're enough. Absolutely, God is glorified when sick people get well. But He's also glorified when sick people die well. Do you know that? Yes, He's glorified when He rescues you from your suffering. But do you know He's also glorified when you suffer well? I've spent a lot of time with people who have suffered. I've been to deathbeds where people leave this place way too early. And I've witnessed people say, you can take my body. If I'm healed, I know God is able. But if not, you can take my body because He's enough. He's enough. Somehow we've got this thing all screwed up. You know that? We've got this thing all screwed up, and I don't know if it's bad preaching or bad books or whatever the case might be, but it's all this nonsense that once you give your life to Jesus, He's going to make everything in your life happy, rah, 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 everything's going to be easy. That's not the gospel. You realize that. That's not the gospel. The gospel is this. If you love Jesus, when things go wrong in your life, it doesn't matter because you still have Jesus. And He's enough. He's enough. You know, think about the man or woman that's in another country that may be similar to these guys, knowing that if they give their life to Christ and are baptized in public, that the chances of them losing their life is pretty much a sure thing. And yet they say, that's okay, because if I lose my life, Jesus is enough. We're so cushy, man. We're such a cushy life. We don't have to do stuff like this. We struggle just to tell somebody, you know, God loves you. And here's people that give their life saying, He's enough no matter what happens to me. Jesus is enough. You know, when you become a person of faith, you're no longer dependent on God giving you what you want because He's enough and He's all that you want. All that you want. So listen how the story ends here. The music plays and they don't bow down. And so Nebuchadnezzar, in all of his ego, gets really fired up, and so he fires up the furnace. It says 7 times hotter than normal. In fact, it was so hot that those who placed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire died because they got that close to the furnace. And so they're in there, and the Bible says that they fall into the fire. They're all tied up, you know, and they fall into the fire, into the furnace. And then God is able, and He delivers them completely unburned. Clothes don't even smell like smoke. The ropes didn't even singe. It's incredible. Look what happens in verse 28. All of that happens, and in verse 28, Nebuchadnezzar says, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and rescued His servants. They trusted in Him and defied the king's commands and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore," listen to this, "I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be burned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Oh my gosh, it's incredible. You know, the world is watching. The world is watching. And do you want them to know that there's no other God that saves but Jesus? And they will know that when we're in situations that are bigger than us And God rescues. He's able. But He'll also know, people will also know when we're in situations where we recognize that He's better than whatever the outcome is as well, because He's enough. And the world is watching. They're watching. And some of you know exactly what this feels like right now. You're calling out to God and you're thinking, are you able? Are you able? Well, let me finish with this. This is probably one of the best verses in all of the Bible. Verse 25 says this, King Nebuchadnezzar, he's just thrown them into the fire, and he said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the Son of the gods. Let me tell you as clear as I can, it was the Son of God. And He was in the fire with them. They put in 3, and then He recognizes that there's 4 people in there, and the 4th one, He says, it must be the Son of gods. It's actually Jesus Christ. And again, the whole thing points to the cross. We have a God, imagine this, who would walk through the fire of judgment for you and then come out of the fire on the other side completely alive. That's what Christ has done for us. He went into the fire for you. Your sins separated you from God so that you can know that He loves you and that He'll never leave you if you've given your life to Jesus Christ. Jesus did that for me, and He did it for you. And so now I'm willing to die in the flames with Him, whatever happens. Healthy, wealthy, prosperity, poverty, sickness, death. God has given Himself for me on the cross. That's all that matters to me, and now I'm going to give myself back to Him. Crossroads, it's been a pretty unbelievable 25 years, hasn't it? It really has. There's been moments when we've said, we feel like we're in group 1, right? There's moments where we feel like we're in group 1. I remember one particular moment that, and you may or not remember this, I don't know, but this was early on in my ministry here, and financially things were really tough. And I got an email from my admin saying that if we didn't get $19,000 on Sunday morning, that we wouldn't have enough money to pay the bills. $19,000. Our average giving at that point was somewhere around $5,000 or $6,000. And I just prayed, said, God, You are bigger. You are able. You're better than whatever the outcome is, God, but I really believe that You are able to do this. And I remember getting ready on Sunday morning and being in the shower and just praying to God, God, You could do this today. You can do this today. And the offering that weekend was $19,060 or something like that for the weekend. Group 1, man, I love being in group 1. I love that, But there have certainly been plenty of times, too, when we've been in group 2 and we call out to God and we say, God is able. But even if He doesn't, we know. And we know that He is still God and He's better than the outcome. And we've had suffering, right? But we know that He's enough, even in that suffering. And I believe greater days are ahead of us, and I believe it's going to require of us greater faith. There's going to be times when He's going to prove that He's bigger. He's going to come through and show that He's able. There's going to be times when we know that He's able, but He wants us to learn that He's actually better than whatever the outcome is. And hey, it's going to increase our faith. And that sounds like a lot of fun to me. So whatever God has in plan for us, in store for us over the next 25 years, I just pray, God, increase our faith. Give us a greater faith, because I want to be a part of something greater, and I want my faith to grow greater. I want to recognize that You're bigger and better, and that You are enough no matter what. There's a second question I want to ask you too. Have you given your life to Jesus Christ? Have you surrendered your life to Him? Worship team, y'all can come on. Have you given your life to Him? The one that the Scriptures say right here, no other God can save in this way. Have you recognized the saving power of Jesus Christ? You don't need a better life. You need Jesus. And without Jesus, you're ultimately lost. But once you know Him, everything else is good. You got nothing to worry about. Why don't you bow your heads for just a moment and close your eyes? And I just wonder if there's anyone here in this situation that needed to be reminded today, number one, that Jesus was enough. Jesus is enough. Is there anybody here that you're going through a tough situation and you know God's able, you know He's bigger, and you just came to a place today where you said, you know what, no matter the outcome, I know He's better than any outcome, and He's enough. Is there anybody here that would say that? I see a few hands. Any others? Thank you. Is there anyone here this morning that would say that I've recognized this morning that He is the God who saves, and I need to give my life to Him. I need to surrender my life to Him. Is there anybody here that would say that? He is the God who saves. I need to give my life to Him. I want to surrender my life to Him. Thank you. Anybody else? Thank you. Any others? Well, thank you for your honesty. For those of you who have said you're going through a tough situation and recognize that He's enough today. Thank you for those who have said that you want to surrender your life to Him and follow Him. And so let me just pray for you and in both of those situations. God, thank you for your great love for us. Thank you that we know that you are able. We know that you are the God who saves. There's no other God like you. You are the one true God. So God, in the situations that are before us and before many of those that are sitting here today, God, help us to recognize and know that you are bigger, that you are able, that you can, just in the same way that you did with all of those heroes of faith in Hebrews, you can come through. When we have an issue that no one else can come through on, we know that you can come through. You are able. God, help us to understand and know that no matter what happens, just in the same way with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, no matter what happens in our life, whether we end up in group one where we say, this God showed Himself bigger, or if we end up in group two where we end up sawing in two and there's no relief, but we know that you're enough, you're better than any outcome. I pray for that, for every person here. And God, I lift those to you that have said today that they want to give their heart and life to you and surrender to you. And if that was you this morning, there's nothing magical about it. It's just a matter of surrender. It's just a matter of saying to Him that you believe in Him. Just tell Him that. Tell Him you believe in Him, that He died for you, that He died for your sins, that He saved you, that He is the God who saves. Tell Him you are the God who saves, and thank you for saving me. And I give my life to you today. I surrender my life to you today. Teach me what it means to follow you. We have the great privilege today of remembering the sacrifice of Jesus Christ as we do this reflection time together. He is the one who saves. We've been saved by the sacrifice of Christ, that His body was broken for us and His blood spilled for us. And if you're unsure about that, if you haven't surrendered your life to Him, or you're just exploring, and we're really glad that you're here. We're not here to put you on the spot this morning. This is for those who have surrendered their life to Christ. So just let the cracker and the juice pass by. It's fine. Just let it pass by. We're not here to put you on the spot. No one's going to point you out. We're just glad you're here. I pray that watching us do this will have some impact on you and point you towards the Jesus Christ who saves, who gave His life, His body, and His blood for us. And if you believe that Jesus died on the cross, that He rose again, if you've given your life to Him, and that He's the one who saves, then we welcome you to take the Lord's Supper with us today. So let's reflect together as we remember the great sacrifice of Christ, the one who saves, the one who's bigger, the one who's better, the one who is really enough for us.